just certain activities that involve the exercise of higher faculties, which those have the dominant place. And then in chapter 4 of utilitarianism, he makes the argument, and we do not go over that argument, that the only thing desirable, in fact, is happiness. And that all things are desirable either as a means to or as a part of happiness. Again, where happiness is thought of in this rather large, broad, comprehensive way. Now, Mill's first principle, one might say, of practical reasoning is this. We ought always to arrange social institutions and to act so as to produce the most good. And that's a principle he argues for in the Logic, the last chapter, the last book of his Logic, published in 1843. And that is reflected a bit in chapter 1 of utilitarianism. So that Mill's principle of utility, now to use his name for it, you notice chapter 4 is called the proof of the principle of utility. And what he actually does there is to prove that happiness is the only thing that's good, the only thing desirable. So he might say in his language, as opposed to how I've been using the term, his principle of utility is that happiness alone is good. And then if we put those two principles together, we get his principle of right and justice, which you might read as, we ought always to arrange social institutions and to act so as to produce the most happiness. So that's a kind of summary of what Mill does with the notion of utility. Then we come to his account in chapter 5 of On Utilitarianism, his account of rights and of justice. So this is a very important chapter. Again, this is an amendment of Bentham, as I pointed out, and I won't go over that now. And that is done in paragraphs. The account of rights that ought to focus on particularly in paragraphs 16 to 25. And in this connection, I notice a problem with Mill's account. The problem is this. In his official view, now when I refer to someone's official view, I mean that's what they explicitly say as opposed perhaps to what they do, actually how they argue. Mill's official view is that moral rights are the legal rights that we ought to have. That is, that they are the legal rights that we would have if law and institutions satisfied the principle of utility and were arranged to realize the most happiness. So they have this connection with legal rights, a kind that we might enforce. Sometimes he goes on to add a qualification that if it would be very much impractical to actually enforce these rights, then the law would not do so. But that would be the kind of grounds that would block it. So that's his official view, that the ultimate argument always appeals to, in the case of rights, moral rights, to this application of the principle of utility, in my sense, that is, his principle of right to maximize happiness. Now, he also has another view that seems to be implicit in the text, is that moral rights are owed to each person, so that all have equal rights, which secure and protect the essential elements of our well-being, the very groundwork of our existence. Those are phrases which he uses. He goes on to say that the sentiment of justice develops in part, I say in part and not was toto, because there's another element to it, in part from the natural impulse. One place says the natural instinct of self-defense, self-preservation, or the defense of those that we care for. So we had a problem about Mill's view, namely, why should Mill's official view lead to and coincide with what I call his other view about there being these equal moral rights? Why should that happen? And that was the problem that I suggested, and also suggested that in utilitarianism, Mill never clearly faces this particular problem. So, after that, we then go on to liberty and see, well, maybe he faces it in liberty. And let's see what we can do to get an answer that's satisfactory to that essay. So the question also, I think, isn't clearly faced either in On Liberty. That isn't explicitly said. The other essay, I have this sort of problem, you see. Now I'm going to explain to you how they coincide. He doesn't do that. So the answer one wants to suggest is an answer that he could give to us if we saw him and harassed him on some occasion and said, well, why didn't you say this? Or something like that. In any case, we want to do the best we can for him, otherwise we don't bother to read it, first place. Now, I stated Mill's essay in the form of 3 clauses, and I'll go over those again, because I think I did that the other day and not everyone was here. And I will do this fairly briefly, but I hope perhaps this whole thing will help. The first clause is that society, by the use of law, as in legal enforcement of rights, or the use of moral pressure of public opinion as the pressure of a certain moral judgment, that's right and wrong, in those forms society can never interfere with individuals' beliefs or their choice of way of life or their associations with one another, except to protect the legitimate interests of what I think Mill means by that, the rights of others. And in particular, then only reasons of right and wrong can be appealed to in discussing this question of interference. Now, when I substitute the phrase there, legitimate interests or rights, you may ask where I get that from. The answer is you must look, because it's practically, it isn't the only place in the essay, but by far the clearest and most explicit place in it. You must look to chapter 4, paragraphs 1 to 12. If you don't study this carefully, you'll have no idea what is going on. You have to do that. Example of a writer who doesn't, unfortunately, we're all the same way, actually, put everything where it's easiest to notice. That's my job. It's in chapter 4, paragraphs 1 to 12. And I think you will see, at least I suggest, that the legitimate interests or harm and injuries, all these sort of vague notions that appear earlier in the essay, there get explained as legitimate interests or rights. So, what the principle does then in this first clause, as explained in those paragraphs, is to exclude 3 kinds of reasons for how the boundary might be drawn one way rather than another. That is, the boundary between the claims of the individual and the claims of society. Those 3 kinds of reasons are paternalistic reasons, as I'll call them. That is, reasons that are based on society's promoting the individual's good in ways that the individual would resist or object to. In concern for them because they are unable for some way or other in society's judgment to take care of themselves. One would exclude paternalistic reasons. one also excludes reasons of excellence or of human ideals or certain forms of non-moral perfection. That is, one cannot make these interferences on the grounds that people that would be more excellent in, say, some aesthetic way, some non-moral way, but nevertheless reasons of excellence. And the third kind of reason, which I think is excluded, is reasons of mere dislike or preference, even if it be the preference on the part of the majority, vast majority of society as a whole. So I think that what the principle does in Mill's understanding of it is to impose certain limits on the reasons that can be introduced into public discussion. And by public discussion, I mean discussions as to where law and moral opinion as a form of public pressure ought to draw the boundary between the claims of the individual and the claims of society. Then the second clause of the principle then says, and the rest of it goes fairly easy, that if certain forms of conduct do seem to interfere with the legitimate interests, that is, the rights of others would be another term for that. If they seem to interfere with what we might want to say are others' rights, then the question of legal and social interference with the conduct and beliefs and so on of individuals may be discussed. So it's just open for discussion. And it may be discussed, and this be discussed on its merits, but always, again, with the restriction that one can introduce these other three kinds of reasons. So then, it's easy enough to, we'll just tie it together by adding a third clause which says that because the injury to the legitimate interests of others alone can justify legal and social interference with the conduct of individuals, it does not follow that it always does so. So the question then remains to be settled on the merits, taking into account the totality of permitted reasons and excluding those that are not permitted. Okay, now that's what I take the principle to be. Now, this principle, recall, holds only under certain social conditions, and it only applies to certain sorts of people. It does not apply to children. It does not apply to those mentally disturbed and so on. We're excluding those kinds of exceptions. And Mill also believes that it only applies to at a certain stage of society. Doesn't apply in backward ages, as he says, and a variety of other circumstances. But he's concerned, of course, as I mentioned the first day, with the democratic society that he perceives becoming in the future. And that's where he's concerned that it does by all means apply. And recall that his vocation is to try to appeal to advanced opinion, of one might say, and educate advanced opinion in those principles which he thinks are necessary and ought to attain in this society to come. Now, keep in mind that this principle of liberty guarantees to all citizens, at least the way I read it, in the fifth democratic society to come, and Mill thinks in the society of his day, it's not far in the future, it's as it were here now, it's imminent. It guarantees to all citizens an equal right to freedom of thought, it says. So these rights are equal, and he also regards them, as far as I can see, for practical purposes, absolute. That is, this principle is to govern absolutely the way in which society draws the boundaries in law and in moral opinion as public pressure as a coercive between the claims of society on the one hand, the claims of the individual on the other. It's to regulate those absolutely without exception, and the rights it gives are equal. Now, for an example of this, you might look at the first paragraph of chapter 2, where Mill talks about it. Society would not have the right to silence a lone dissenter. Would not have that right even if they found this person very objectionable, they did not like him, and so forth and so on. All these excluded reasons. It says absolutely they could not have that right. Paragraph 1, chapter 2, I think, implies that. Now, because the principle of liberty establishes equal rights, which are for practical purposes absolute, and not to be overridden by seemingly plausible consideration, which you often take to be such, it seems to rest on a doctrine of rights independent of the notion of utility. That's how it strikes a lot of people. And perhaps it does, if that's our problem, whether it does or not. But Mill denies this. He denies it fairly emphatically, because that's not the case. I take no advantage of a doctrine of that kind. Now, one might take the view that Mill is simply a confused and incoherent and so forth. I don't take that view. It's certainly not. That's not the explanation of what's going on. So what we want to do is to see, is there at least a plausible answer, not saying a correct answer, but we say a plausible answer that a very bright man like Mill might have held, that explains how he thinks things are supposed to go, to connect these views. Now, what I'm going to suggest is something like this. I've always been sort of uncertain if this is a fully adequate answer, but it seems to me to attribute to Mill an answer that's plausible and, I think, quite interesting. That the best way, then, he is saying, to advance and to realize what he calls the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. That's obviously a very key phrase we have to try to understand. Permanent interest of man as a progressive being. That the best way to do that is to follow the principle of liberty as a principle of political right and justice in the democratic society to come. He's proposing this principle as what I've called previously in other connections as a political principle, and he is proposing that to be followed. And since this principle secures these equal rights, etc., it is to be followed without exception, and so on. Now, it needs emphasis that this principle is, in the suggestion that I'm making, it's a principle of political justice. And it is to be publicly recognized, that is, in the public forum where questions of law and how to draw the boundaries between the claims of individuals and the claims of society are discussed. And that's what I mean with public forum here. It is to be recognized as governing that discussion. And that's the importance of it, or part of the importance of it. Now, one, I should also note that Mill has in mind here, or anyway, I'm interpreting him as having in mind here, this conception of utility that underlies it, namely he thinks of institutions, as I mentioned a moment ago, as educating national character. It's going to have an influence on national character. Now, I'm supposing him to think that the public principles of political justice governed discussion of where to draw the boundaries between the claims of individuals and the claims of societies is one of those institutions. It's an institution that you might say takes the form of discussion, but nevertheless it's a very important kind of institutionalized principle in the sense that it's regularly followed by people and recognized to be mutually accepted and so on. So I take Mill to be saying is that what we have to take into account in seeing the importance of this principle is to understand it in that way, so that he is concerned then with the effect of the principle of liberty as a public principle of political justice, its effect on national character, how it will make people think and behave and understand themselves and so on, not only in the effects in a more specific sense and presenting sense that it might have had. So for Mill, as I mentioned a moment ago, the worth of institutions is very importantly to be taken as the kinds of people that they encourage, the kinds of character, qualities of mind, and all those other things that they bring about. And therefore, I take him to say something like this, that he insists on taking the long-term effects, quite long-term effects, of institutions on national character and the publicity effects of political discussion as, the publicity effects of the principle of liberty itself as it governs public discussion. But I don't think that this gives us yet, although it helps us to perceive now what Mill is getting at. You see, he's saying something like, it's only if we follow it absolutely in public discussion do we get the benefits of it. And since the principle itself requires equal rights and so on, that's where these equal rights are coming from. Beginning to get a hold on what his argument is, at least I hope at any rate, some beginning to get a hold of it. But I don't think we have all of the elements of it. I'm going to introduce another, then I will come back to try to conclude the general picture. The element I have in mind is Mill's discussion of individuality in Chapter 3 of On Liberty. And again, this is a very important part of the book, particularly the first 9 paragraphs, although there are other important paragraphs in it, but in this paragraph is a quite sustained account of his idea of individuality. Now, that's a term I will use, individuality, and Mill thinks that somehow we have to work that out. This idea is connected with the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. And I think essential to these interests is the free development of individuality. This is what Mill says in these paragraphs. And I think that these essentials combine 2 main components. There's one I would describe using his own language as the Greek ideal of self-development of all our various natural powers, including, of course, importantly, the exercise of our higher faculties into some kind of harmonious whole. That's a notion he takes from von Humboldt, who was a German philosopher that I think the book was published, that she quotes from in 1795. Then the second part, a component of this idea of self-development, is the Christian ideal of self-government. And that this ideal includes, as I interpret Mill, the recognizing the limits imposed by the basic rights, equal basic rights that are secured by justice, and so the rights to secure the legitimate interests of others. He's very insistent in paragraph 9 of this essay. I want to be sure to note that recognizing the equal rights of others and being made to comply with those is not incompatible with this ideal of individuality that he's presenting, but is essential to the notion of this aspect of it of self-government. So individuality, as he understands it, includes this recognition and acting in accordance with some basic rights. Now, these two elements are stated by Mill, marked in the form that I have mentioned them in paragraph 9. And here Mill says that if it is any part of religion to believe that we were created by a good being, it is consistent with religion to believe that we have the higher faculties in order that these faculties can be cultivated and unfolded and not rooted out and consumed. It's also consistent with religion to believe these things, that God delights in our approaching this full realization of our powers and the ideal conception of ourselves embodied in it. And it's in this paragraph that Mill rejects what he calls the Calvinistic conception of humanity and imposes to that his own conception. Now, as Mill presents these notions here in chapter 3, they don't seem to be purely psychological doctrines. They strike one or can as an account of human excellence, as his preferred view or philosophical doctrine of what human beings ought to be. And if they are that way, then they realize a higher degree of human excellence. And on this account, you might say, that part of the purpose of Mill's view of political and social institutions is to make people of this sort possible and to do what one can to encourage them. Now, that poses a problem that I'll come back to, whether that's the case or not. Now, Mill's conception of individuality, actually, I think I'm going to have to skip over this, I think, to give the general picture. That is, skip over his account of individuality. And I just urge you to read that, to work out the various elements in it. Some of them will fall under the idea of self-government, recognizing the rights of others. The others would fall under the ideal of self-development, which is the other aspect of it, making our beliefs our own, making our desires our own, making our character our own. And you want to think about what's all that mean. Is that just a phrase? Making desires, beliefs, and character our own. And how do we do that? What's involved in doing that? And I think he means sort of appropriating in our own way various resources of our culture and adding to those again in our own way, and that we can only do that under what he thinks the institutions that are guaranteed by the principle of liberty. And that is something that you have that I urge you to look at. There are various aspects of it that differ from previous accounts of toleration and so forth and so on. One of those main aspects is that there is no longer the case that one is so anxious about falling into error. It is in a religious age, if it's a belief that you must believe the truth or you face damnation, then it's far harder to experiment with new ideas. And it's far harder to urge the kind of view that Mill holds, because it puts, I'd say, roughly not equal emphasis, who knows what the emphasis is. That is, it's important to believe what's true in Mill's view, but it's also important that it be something that you believe, that you have worked out and you've been able to appropriate and understand it. That's what's involved in making beliefs your own. So the only important thing isn't that you believe what's true, you also must believe it in a certain way. And that's not an element that's new with Mill, but it is an element that distinguishes his age from an earlier one. Well, let me go on. I would just mention those points hastily, and presuming that we have an understanding of the various aspects of individuality, then let's return to our problem, you might say. Our problem is, how do we get from Mill's understanding of the principle of utility, the way in which I have explained it, to the principle of liberty in this way? How does the first justify the second, explain the grounds of the second? Now, I think Mill's argument, of course, is going to be in some sense from the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. And the way to answer this, in part, is to refer back to Mill's account of utility and the distinction between the higher and the lower pleasures. And recall that this distinction is one between activities. So we're talking about higher and lower activities, as it were, as satisfaction is gained through these. And recall also that the source of the pleasures is the higher and the lower faculties. Faculties of intellect, imagination, feeling, and so on, as opposed to so-called lower faculties, needs, and so on. Now, also recall Mill's decided preference criteria. That is, the higher pleasures are specified by this criterion. So let's say that Mill assumes that it's a deep psychological fact about human beings that follows, namely, that in the absence of some special explanation, that people will put at the center of their life and organize their life around the activities that are connected with the higher faculties. That's just a fact about what they will do. And that this psychological fact will then connect up with what Mill describes as the sense of dignity and so on. And it's also a possible way, which I'll come to in a moment, of interpreting his ideal of individuality. Though we don't have to say it introduces a perfectionist notion, because it might be a way of aborting that. And recall finally that Mill uses the decided preference criterion also to determine quantity. That is, it's introduced to determine quantity of the lower pleasures, and it also means, the way I interpret him to understand it, that the higher pleasures are indefinitely higher in value than fulfillment of the lower pleasures. Well, that isn't very accurately stated, but you get the idea, perhaps. I won't try to put it exactly. Now, I believe that then Mill is making also certain further assumptions. Namely, he's assuming that all normal persons, and suppose we stay within this simplification for the moment, are equally capable of enjoying the higher pleasures. That is, everyone has a higher faculty. All normal persons have the higher faculties. And given suitable opportunities, say under equal education and so forth and so on, they will be able to educate these faculties, and they will then be able effectively to exercise them so as to obtain various forms of permanent enjoyment from them. In that sense, make them central foci of their life. Seem to run out of something. Sorry. Need some more pages. Now, it's important here what Mill is assuming, that the distinction between the higher and the lower pleasures is really a dualism. That is, we just make a distinction between the higher and the lower, and the higher are very much in value greater. So that we're not going to have to rank or to compare the value of the higher pleasures of an Einstein, for example, over someone else just, engaged in some higher pleasure at home. Perhaps they're gardening, perhaps they're designing a bookshelf and so on. I mean, they have some plan about how they're going to redo their house and so forth and so on. That's kind of aesthetic endeavor of some kind. There are lots of ways of engaging in the higher pleasures in Mill's view, at least so I'm interpreting it. And we don't compare these at some level. I mean, if we frightening prospects, say, to compare the interests that some of them have in amateur music and mathematics, try to compare it in any value in some sense to Einstein and Mozart. I mean, we wouldn't come out very well, at least I would. And I take Mill would be saying we're not supposed to do that. We don't establish any kind of fine-grained interpersonal comparisons of qualities of the higher pleasures. We just don't do that. In fact, he never makes any attempt to do that. What's important is the dualism. And it's the way people organize their lives. So we might say he is making the following kind of assumption. Recall the cat's example. He's assuming that in any case within the family of human being, that the higher pleasures that human beings are capable of are effectively equal. That is, if we have a mode of life that we adopt and follow under this decided preference criteria, and we succeed at it, then the higher pleasures that anyone gets with anyone else are the same. We're not going to have interpersonal comparison for numerical kind within that division. That's the way I'm interpreting it. So we have that the capacities, then we could put it more formally, that the capacities for the higher pleasures of all people is potentially equal. We don't distinguish different grades. Another assumption he's making is that the particular form or mode of existence that is best for any one individual in particular can only be ascertained by that particular individual under conditions where the decided preference criterion is operative. And that means, for it to be operative, the institutions of liberty must be established. In other words, what I want to say is that the principle of liberty establishes the conditions under which the decided preference criterion can operate. And then it will be left to individuals to ascertain what their mode of life should be that best fits their particular character. That is, it's something like Mill is saying each individual has a peculiar bent. They're not the same. And there's no general psychological theory of human nature that tells us how to identify what sorts of people are going to prefer what modes of life. And in that sense, find modes of life best adapted to them and therefore achieve the best modes suited to their nature. We have to leave that to them. I believe he's assuming that. Okay? So it's only if the principle of liberty is enforced, which sets up the conditions of the decided preference criterion to operate, which in turn is the only way to allow the individuals to ascertain the best form of life for them. It's only if all those things are done that society can proceed in any rational way to maximize utility. Because otherwise we would lack the information. See, there's no way to ascertain what is going to be the mode of life people will prefer without those conditions. So there is, you see the importance, in other words, that there not being any general psychological theories, I'm reading it, that would enable some all-observing, all-knowing scientists to say, well, we do it by ascertaining certain features of people, and then I can tell you ahead of time what's the best mode of life for you. That's not, that I am presuming that Mill is saying can't be the case, or isn't the case. Well, this amazed me with the question of where the ideal of excellence is going to fit in. And I hope I have given some kind of argument to Mill, sketched it out, how we get from his notion of utility to this principle of liberty, understood as principle of equal right, and the whole absolutely set. I hope I've done that. Now, the question is, well, maybe I'll begin with this the next time, but I want you to think about it. Is there a way, and I think there is a way, of saying that this ideal of individuality is not a perfectionist ideal, although it's often so described. And one might give that interpretation of Mill, and it's not at all implausible. But I think, given what he wants to say and the drift of his view, it would be better to say that its status is the following. It does not define an ideal that belongs to the notion of the good to be maximized. It is rather again, it's part of the deep psychological fact that when the principle of liberty is established and the conditions for the decided preference of criterion obtained, then many people, although not everyone, but many people will prefer a mode of existence that realizes, or they strive to realize, the various elements of individuality that Mill described. So that'll just be a fact about human nature, and therefore one wants to make that ideal possible for them, along with other ideals for other people. And then that will be supplemented by Mill's belief that those people who do that, that is, who prefer the mode of life of individuality, are on the whole the very creative and productive people. So that in the long run, society as a whole will benefit. And he emphasizes to this point in 3, in paragraphs 10 to 18. You see, what he does in the early part of the chapter is to present the ideal itself, or what appears to be an ideal itself, and then he emphasizes its great value in the long run for society as a whole, of individuals, of allowing individuals to behave and act in this way. Well, that's an attempt to tie together Mill's views, so it's a plausible view of how his conception of utility leads to rights and connects up with the principle of neighborhood. So I will stop there.
A little bit into this. Now I guess we'll go around. Yeah. But see, this is going to lead up. I think what's the next step for me? All right. Yeah. So then you also do the other.